Good to be with you. This is a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York, and we are interrupting our normal programming because the Supreme Court has just issued what is a major ruling on the president's use of tariffs. We have a team going through this decision right now from a legal and economic and a political point of view. But first, our legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, who has the decision for us in Washington. Jan?
Tony, this decision is 6-3, invalidating President Trump's use of these sweeping tariffs, imposing tariffs on almost every trading partner worldwide. This is the most significant U.S. Supreme loss for a U.S. president, I think, in modern history. It is invalidating what is the cornerstone of President Trump's economic policy, ruling that he does not have authority under this federal law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to levy these sweeping tariffs, like I said, on almost every global trading partner worldwide. Now, there are other issues involved. There are many different decisions from all of the justices. This is a deeply divided issue. They're not agreeing with all of the reasons why. But the bottom line, it is at 6-3 with two of President Trump's appointees, Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Neil Gorsuch, joining the Chief Justice John Roberts and the three liberal justices to invalidate the use of these sweeping tariffs. There are three dissenters, led by another appointee, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joined by Justice Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. But the bottom line, Tony, a major defeat for the president. I think you can put that right up there with some of the most significant Supreme Court losses by a U.S. president in history.
All right, Jan, thank you very much. Let's go to CBS News legal analyst Jessica Levinson, who's also reading this decision with us this morning. We knew this was going to be a nuanced legal case, and indeed it was. What were the big questions and how were they decided?
So the big question, exactly as Jan said, is whether or not the president has the power to impose these sweeping tariffs under this particular law. It looks like a lengthy, divided, and complicated opinion, but the bottom line is exactly what Jan said, which is the president does not have the power under this particular statute. Why? Because of the text of the statute and because of the power that the Constitution gives to the president versus Congress. It looks like, based on our quick reading, that this is all about the idea that the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, that the Constitution gives Congress the power to impose taxes, and that when we look at this particular statute, that it does not look like a delegation of Congress's authority. Like, we have the power under the Constitution. Are we now going to ship that over to you, the president? And today the court says no. Obviously, it's a case with huge implications in terms of the economy, in terms of the power of any president. But based on our reading right now, it looks like this is all about looking at specific words like regulate and determining what that means for the power of any president, again, under this particular statute.
And yet so much money has already been outlaid, in particular by Americans, to deal with these tariffs. So I want to give our legal team a little bit more time to go through this decision and look at the potential remedies, what's been decided here. But in the meantime, I want to bring in our senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, because, Ed, as Jan outlined, this is obviously a major defeat for the White House on one of its key economic policy agendas. What now?
And not only the economic agenda, but arguably the foreign policy agenda as well, Tony, because the hope here at the White House at times was to be able to use the threat of tariffs as sort of a coercive tool to get their way with certain countries or certain parts of the world, most especially Europe in recent weeks. We have no reaction yet from the president, who is at this hour still meeting, we believe, behind closed doors here at the White House with a collection of the nation's governors who happen to be here in town this weekend for their annual meetings in Washington. The president has said, though, in recent weeks that were this to happen and the Supreme Court does not uphold his tariffs, quote, we're screwed. It would take many years to figure out what number we're talking about and even who, when, and where to pay back. The Trump administration's collected at least $130 billion in tariff revenue, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection reports out in recent days. And there will be businesses across this country now wondering, do I get my money back, and do I get it back with interest? More than 100 different companies of all sizes had filed suit, raising questions about the legality of these tariffs. And the question now will be, does he perhaps try to seek tariffs or put them in place in other ways. There are ways, in fact, he could do that. We've seen him, for example, put tariffs on various sectors of the economy, like the semiconductor and manufacturing equipment that goes with them, medium and heavy-duty trucks and parts, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals. Does he perhaps pursue ways to go into those specific sectors, depending on what part of the world they happen to be produced in, if not here in the United States? The other thing he could try to do is use essentially national security rationale to put in place some tariffs as well. But again, no definitive response yet from this White House, which had to know for the last several weeks, if not several months since this was argued, that this was a possibility. And we should also point out the court now, in essence, is aligning itself with public opinion, which has found this to be an incredibly unpopular move to put these tariffs in place, and it contributes to America's concerns about the American voters' concerns about the state of the economy. 63% of Americans oppose these tariffs on goods and services and believe more broadly that the administration has focused too much on imposing tariffs and not enough on driving down prices in other ways. So we will await reaction here. But as Jan said, an incredibly strong rebuke here by the Supreme Court, by two of his appointees joining with the court's liberals to say, no, the president overstepped here, and it's Congress that's supposed to be imposing tariffs as part of U.S. economic policy.
And Ed, and you're right to point out that it is not an exaggeration to say the whole world was waiting on this decision because much of the world has been entangled in these tariffs. And you mentioned the powers of Congress. We have a quote here from the majority opinion. Chief Justice Roberts saying the framers gave Congress alone the power to impose tariffs during peacetime. I want to bring in our Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, who's also reacting to all this for us. Major Garrett, the Supreme Court in other matters has gone in the president's direction, but not on this one. What does that mean?
Well, the Supreme Court is well aware of the constitutional history of generating revenue, a power explicitly reserved to Congress in its origination in the Constitution. And before we had an income tax in this country, we raised revenue principally through tariffs. And there were lots of conflicts that previous Supreme Courts dealt with about the legality of those tariffs. That precedent is a backdrop for this. President Trump has jawboned and criticized this court, saying if you rule against me, you're going to destroy our economy, waging a very aggressive public relations campaign. But the court cares what the Constitution says and what precedent says. It's interesting to note, Tony, this 1977 law that Jan and others have referred to grew out of a crisis with Iran after the Iranian Revolution. And it has been used principally to freeze assets or to levy sanctions. The Trump administration told the Supreme Court it had almost unlimited powers to impose tariffs, not just as an economic matter, but as a diplomatic cudgel. And what the court said, and I think this is important, summarizing the administration's argument before it, that view would represent a transformational expansion of the president's authority over tariff policy. It is also telling, the court wrote, that in the IEEPA's half-century, that's the law of existence, no president has invoked the statute to impose any tariffs, let alone tariffs of this magnitude and scope. So essentially what the court is saying is we have a Congress. Congresses negotiate laws with presidents as this law was negotiated. If you follow that law, you can do it. If you expand way beyond that law, you can't. And to Ed's previous point, there's another law, a 1962 law, the Trade Expansion Act. There's a Section 232 there. This president, previous presidents have used that to impose tariffs. There are many remedies that this administration could look to. And the trade representative, Jamieson Greer, has said many times, if we lose in the Supreme Court, we have other remedies to advance our tariff agenda. This is not the end of the tariff conversation under this administration, but it is a setback significantly on this variant of using tariffs the way the president has attempted to enforce them.
Major, thank you very much. Let's talk about the economic impact now with our CBS News senior business and technology correspondent, Jolene Kent. Joe, Major touched on the magnitude of these tariffs. Ed did as well, $130 billion, give or take, 90% of which American consumers have borne the burden of, according to the New York Reserve. What happens now?
Yeah, that comes from the New York Federal Reserve. But I want to tell you, my phones are exploding right now with reaction from small business owners across the country. We've been interviewing people about these tariffs for over the last year. And Emily Lay, a small business owner in Sarasota, Florida, tells me she's thrilled, she's relieved. It gives us clarity. She runs a very successful stationery and planner business. Another business owner, Beth Beneke in Zumbrata, Minnesota, southern Minnesota, she runs Busy Baby Map. And she says she's seeing major relief, that this is bittersweet. She just signed another $13,000 check to, for these tariffs to China last week. And now she feels like maybe she can start seeking a refund. Now, when you pull back, how much has the average American household paid for these tariffs? You can see it's about $1,700, according to the Yale Budget Lab. So what happens next if this continues to move apace? We expect overall prices, which could be good news for consumers, to drop, but that won't happen quickly. We also expect to see perishable items, your fruits and veggies, they actually might go down in price a little bit more quickly. You might see durable goods like your tech products and furniture see a slight decrease as well. And you can see overall the price increases that you may be facing at home due to tariffs across the board there, especially in apparel, things that are imported from overseas. But if you're looking for a Trump tariff refund, if you will, as an individual family member, for example, that's probably off the table. But we do expect businesses to start seeking tariffs and perhaps forming class action lawsuits to get this money back as a result of this ruling. Those companies could get refunds from the Treasury, but overall, the small business reaction has been overwhelmingly positive, saying they feel that they're thrilled and they're relieved.
All right, Jolene, thank you very much. I want to go back to our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford. After that short breather, she dug into the report a little bit more. Jan, it's not a straightforward ruling. A lot of American businesses are wondering what now, what changed in the last 15 minutes about American economic life?
Well, that's to be determined because, as Jolene said, Trump has other areas. Those are much more limited, though. They can't be this sweeping. But I think what's really interesting, Tony, is 6 of the justices, 3 conservatives and 3 liberals, came together. They didn't agree on the bottom line, but they didn't agree on the reasons, but they agreed on the bottom line. And what this says is that all of these people who've been saying that this is a Supreme Court that's in the tank for Donald Trump need to take a look at the facts. Yes, this is a court that recently has been giving the Trump administration some temporary wins, not letting lower court judges block all of his policies while the litigation unfolded. But as we have discussed, Tony, when the court is considering the merits of these cases involving President Trump, he is not going to win them all. And this will not be the first case he loses in the court this term.
And so, Jan, if we see additional tariff levers used by the president, is there a chance we could end up right back at a crossroads like the one we're at right now?
I'm sure there'll be litigation, but those, I think, are on much more solid legal ground, Tony.
All right, Jan, thank you very much.
Wow, that's a lot of people. That's a new record. We set a record every time. Well, thank you very much for being here. The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. I'd like to thank and congratulate Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh for their strength and wisdom and love of our country, which is right now very proud of those justices. When you read the dissenting opinions, there's no way that anyone can argue against them. There's no way. Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you. The Democrats on the court are thrilled, but they will automatically vote no. They're an automatic no, just like in Congress. They're an automatic no. They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. They're an automatic no, no matter how good a case you have. It's a no. But you can't knock their loyalty. It's one thing you can do with some of our people. Others think they're being politically correct, which has happened before far too often with certain members of this court, and it's happened so often with this court. What a shame. Having to do with voting in particular, when in fact they're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats, and not that this should have anything at all to do with it. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests and a political movement that is far smaller than people would ever think. It's a small movement. I won by millions of votes. We won in a landslide. With all the cheating that went on, there was a lot of it, but we still won in a landslide. Too big to rig. But these people are obnoxious, ignorant, and loud. They're very loud. And I think certain justices are afraid of that. They don't want to do the right thing. They're afraid of it. This was an important case to me, more as a symbol of economic national security, and also, I would say, just for our country itself, so important, because we're doing so well as a country. We've never done so well. The good news is that there are methods, practices, statutes, and authorities, as recognized by the entire court in this terrible decision, and also as recognized by Congress, which they refer to, that are even stronger than the IEEPA tariffs available to me as President of the United States. And in actuality, I was very modest in my ask of other countries and businesses because I wanted to do, and it's very important, I wanted to be very well behaved because I wanted to do anything, I didn't want to do anything that would affect the decision of the court, because I understand the court. I understand how they are very easily swayed. I want to be a good boy. I have very effectively utilized tariffs over the past year to make America great again. Our stock market has just recently broken 50,000 on the Dow, and simultaneously, and even more amazingly, broken 7,000 on the S&P, two numbers that everybody thought upon our landslide election victory could not be attained. Think of that. Nobody thought it was possible to do it within 4 years, and we did it in 1 year. They said, you'll never be able, you'll go back and you read the geniuses, read their statements, all of the Nobel Prize winners in economics. They said, no, you couldn't do it in 4 years. Well, we didn't do it in 4 years. We did it in 1 year. We broke every record in the book, and we're continuing to do so. Tariffs have likewise been used to end 5 of the 8 wars that I settled. I settled 8 wars, whether you like it or not, including India, Pakistan, big ones, nuclear, could have been nuclear. Prime Minister of Pakistan said yesterday at the great meeting that we had, the Peace Board, he said yesterday that President Trump could have saved 35 million lives by getting us to stop fighting. They were getting ready to do some bad things. But they've given us great national security, these tariffs have. And together with our strong borders, reduced fentanyl coming into our country by 30%. When I use them as a penalty against countries illegally sending this poison into our country to poison our youth. All of those tariffs remain. They all remain. I don't know if you know that or not. They all remain. We're still getting them, and we will after the decision. I guess there's nobody left to appeal to. But again, those 3 people, such respect. I've had a lot of respect for them anyway, but such great respect. But other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected. We have alternatives, great alternatives. Could be more money. We'll take in more money, and we'll be a lot stronger for it. We're taking in hundreds of billions of dollars. We'll continue to do so. To show you how ridiculous the opinion is, however, the court said that I'm not allowed to charge even $1. I can't charge $1. Can't charge $1. I would have used 1 penny, but we don't make the pennies anymore. We save money. Can't charge $1 to any country under IEEPA. Not $1. I assume to protect other countries. This must have been done to protect those other countries, certainly not the United States of America, which they should be interested in protecting. That's what they're supposed to be protecting. But I am allowed to cut off any and all trade or business with that same country. In other words, I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1. Because that's not what it says. And that's not the way it even reads. I can do anything I want to do to them, but I can't charge any money. So I'm allowed to destroy the country, but I can't charge them a little fee. I could give them a little two-cent fee, but I cannot charge under any circumstances. I cannot charge them anything. Think of that. How ridiculous is that? I'm allowed to embargo them. I'm allowed to tell them you can't do business in the United States anymore. We want you out of here. But if I want to charge them $10, I can't do that. It's incorrect. Their decision's incorrect. But it doesn't matter because we have very powerful alternatives that have been approved by this decision. You know, they've been approved by the decision for those that thought they had us. And they're saying that I have the absolute right to license, but not the right to charge a license fee. So think of that. I have the right to license, which is a very powerful word. In many ways, license is more powerful than tariffs. In fact, I was thinking about using it. But they came up with the idea that I can license, just like the people that were opposing me told them to do, but not the right to charge a license fee. Think of that. Who ever heard of such a thing? What license has ever been issued without the right to charge a fee? You get a license, you charge a fee. It's automatic, but not with this court. But now the court has given me the unquestioned right to ban all sorts of things from coming into our country, to destroy foreign countries, but a much more powerful right than many people ever thought we even had, but not the right to charge a fee. How crazy is that? Our country is the hottest country anywhere in the world right now. And it was a dead country 1.5 years ago under an incompetent president. But now I'm going to go in a different direction, probably the direction that I should have gone the first time, but I read the language. I'm very good at reading language, and it read our way 100%, but now I'll go the way I could have gone originally, which is even stronger than our original choice. As Justice Kavanaugh, whose stock has gone so up, you have to see, I'm so proud of him, wrote in his dissent, although I firmly disagree with the court's holding today, the decision might not substantially constrain a president's ability to order tariffs going forward. So, think of that. The decision might not substantially constrain. And it doesn't, he's right. In fact, I can charge much more than I was charging. So I'm going to just start. Although I firmly disagree with the court's holding today, the decision might not substantially constrain a president's ability to order tariffs going forward. That's because numerous other federal statutes, which is so true, authorize the president to impose tariffs and might justify most, if not all, of the tariffs issued in this case. Even more tariffs, actually. Those statutes include, think of that, those statutes include, for example, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Section 232. All of these things I know so well. The Trade Act of 1974, Sections 122, 201, 301. And the Tariff Act of 1930, Section 338, all clear. But it's a little bit longer process. I thought I'd make things simple, but they didn't let us do that. I would like to thank Justice Kavanaugh for frankly, his genius and his great ability. Very proud of that appointment. In actuality, while I am sure that they did not mean to do so, the Supreme Court's decision today made a president's ability to both regulate trade and impose tariffs more powerful and more crystal clear rather than less. I don't think they meant that. I'm sure they didn't. It's terrible. And to think that the Democrats who oppose this only because they want to go the opposite way, they'd like to pack the court. They want to put on 21 people. They want to pack the court, pack the Supreme Court. Maybe they should do it. Maybe they would be better off if they did it. They want to pack the court. They want to do anything to hurt our country. There will no longer be any doubt, and the income coming in and the protection of our companies and country will actually increase because of this decision. I don't think the court meant that, but it's the way it is. Based on long-standing law and hundreds of victories, and even, as I was pointed out before, even thousands of victories over the years, to the contrary, the Supreme Court did not overrule tariffs. They merely overruled a particular use of IEEPA tariffs. And essentially, it's used to get a fee. I can do anything I want with IEEPA, anything. I just can't charge anybody for it. I can license, I just can't charge them. It's ridiculous, but it's okay because we have other ways, numerous other ways. The ability to block, embargo, restrict, license, or impose any other condition on a foreign country's ability to conduct trade with the United States under IEEPA has been fully confirmed by this decision. So now there's no doubt, because, you know, there were a lot of questions about tariffs because no president was smart enough to use them to protect our country from those countries and businesses that were ripping us off. You took a look at the deficits that we had with some of these countries. It was disgraceful what they got away with for many, many decades. But now we know, because this decision affirms all those things that some people weren't sure about. In order to protect, and it says so, in order to protect our country, a president can actually charge more tariffs than I was charging in the past period of a year under the various tariff authorities. So we can use other of the statutes, other of the tariff authorities, which have also been confirmed and are fully allowed. Therefore, effective immediately, all national security tariffs under Section 232 and existing Section 301 tariffs, they're existing, they're there, remain in place, fully in place, and in full force and effect. Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies. Thank you for your attention to this matter, and I say quite simply, which I've said for a long time, make America great again. And interestingly, we've already made it great, so I don't have to use that, but I don't think we'll ever give up on MAGA. MAGA is always going to be with us.
The Supreme Court handed President Trump a significant defeat for his economic agenda today, ruling his use of emergency tariffs is illegal. In a 6-3 decision, the justices determined the president does not have the power under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose taxes. The ruling strikes a stunning blow to the centerpiece of the president's economic agenda. It also marks the first major ruling by the High Court against the president's expanded use of power in office. He spoke about the ruling at a press conference a short time ago.
I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1.
Let's go ahead now and go to CBS News White House correspondent Willie James Inman, who joins us from the White House. So, Willie, I guess one of the big headlines, in addition to how unhappy the president was with this ruling and some of his scathing remarks against the justices, is what he is going to use instead to sort of skirt around this issue that he's not allowed to use IEEPA, the Emergency Powers Act, to impose these levies.
Lindsay, the president calling this a ridiculous decision and blasting those Supreme Court justices who sided against his emergency powers that he used, IEEPA, as you described it, those emergency powers for sweeping tariffs across the board, in large part against U.S. allies, in some cases foes. We know that the president, he certainly did not like this decision, jokingly referring to the State of the Union when you typically have all of the justices seated there on Capitol Capitol Hill, along with lawmakers, saying essentially that they are barely invited to his State of the Union speech that is set to happen on Tuesday next week. Well, in terms of the president's announcement, he announced this 10% across the board tariff for 5 months on goods around the world, in large part to essentially go back to what he's been doing all along, to announce those sweeping tariffs that he says, in terms of those trade relations with other nations around the world, is unfair. He's simply he talked about the powers that he's going to use. Specifically, he's referring to Section 122 of the Trade Act, which calls for the president to powers that he can use to enact tariffs. In large part, those tariffs are limited, though, up to 15%, maximum of 150 days. So those two limits, 15%, 150 days. So the president likely going to be limited in terms of that potential power unless he gets the power to, of course, the input from Congress. Now, I do want to play some sound from the president when he talked about the tariffs and the situation that happened with the Supreme Court and his reaction there. Listen.
I don't think the court meant it, because the court doesn't show great spirit toward our country, in my opinion. A lot of bad decisions, but there are usually ways around it. This is something we could have done, as Justice Kavanaugh said, we could have done this originally, but we're doing it now. And the numbers could be far greater than the hundreds of billions we've already taken in.
And Lindsay, on top of that, the president talking about other authorities that he's going to use to call for more tariffs, specifically when it comes to Section 301 of the Trade Act, which in large part investigates certain unfair trade practices. There are already some Section 301 investigations into China's semiconductor industry, for instance, so that will certainly be coming down the road. But in large part, these 10% tariffs, the president saying that is going to be put into place in the next few days, Lindsay.
Okay, Willie James Inman, thank you. Let's go ahead and bring in CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford. And Jan, I think when you speak, we all listen. And this morning, when you said in the special report, this is one of the most consequential decisions in a modern presidency, I think I can speak for myself when I say I was floored by that analysis. What else can you tell us?
Well, and the reason that is because, as you'd said earlier, this is really kind of the core of President Trump's economic policies. And so the court is putting serious constraints on what he wants to do by saying that this federal statute does not authorize him to impose these sweeping, unlimited tariffs on pretty much every one of our trading partners worldwide. And as Willie said, he's going to now, as President Trump said, do it a different way. The problem with that is that the different way that he now has to follow, he doesn't like as much, because there's a cap on that, as Willie said. And so even though that cap is actually lower than what the average of what President Trump was doing under his previous attempt, he had that hammer, Lindsay, where he could threaten to do 25, 35, 40. That was a key negotiating thing for him, he believed. And then also, of course, it's limited, right? It's 5 months and not just endless. So that affects, again, kind of the hammer that he had to try to do some of these deals, trade deals with our partners. But sure, he's going to go ahead with this. As he said, there's other avenues. I thought what was also striking in this was just his tone and how he was actually lashing out at the Supreme Court, suggesting that they were under the influence of foreign interests. Two of those justices in the majority, of course, he nominated. And, you know, this is a court that just 2 years ago in 2024 voted 6-3 that presidents, including President Trump, could not be prosecuted for their official acts while in office. President Trump really liked that decision. And Democrats and liberals were bashing the court, calling the court illegitimate, in the pocket of Trump. And so I think what's interesting today is to see this is actually a Supreme Court, 9 justices, all with very different views, many of them on the law, struggling to reach the right answers as they see it, interpreting the Constitution, interpreting federal statutes. And they're not going to make everyone happy. And Trump, this may be in his first big loss this term, but it's not going to be his last. He's going to lose other cases this term, and he's also going to be very unhappy. He may win some, and then the liberals will be unhappy. But that's how our system works.
Called it embarrassing to their families. All right, Jan Crawford. Let's go ahead and bring in CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman. Katrina, one thing that the president mentioned in his remarks that we have also been talking about all day in our coverage is this issue of refunds. the justices didn't really lay out how this is going to go down.
That's right, Lindsay. And what the president said is that he mentioned that it's not discussed in the opinion and said that this will be tied up in court for 5 years. We know people have already been preparing for the potential of this opinion. They have been preparing their lawsuits, getting lawyers. But the only mention of refunds in the opinion was in the dissent that Justice Kavanaugh wrote. And he referenced this. He said the court did not lay out a plan here. Even during the arguments, Justice Amy Coney Barrett had said that it's going to be a mess figuring out these refunds. So they haven't laid out a roadmap, and the president is now saying this is just going to be tied up in litigation for years.
What did you make of all of the different concurrent and dissenting opinions in this? I think some, 170 pages in this decision?
Lindsay, I am still making my way through everything, but I think it shows even though there was unity here with 3 liberal and 3 conservative justices coming together, there were also differences in the reasoning. That's why we have so many different opinions here. So I think that that is very significant what each of them rely on and where they differ. For instance, Chief Justice John Roberts talked a lot about the major questions doctrine, which says that when it comes to matters of economic and political importance, Congress very clearly gives over that authority. And he relied on that a lot in his opinion. Justice Kagan, in her concurrence, said she didn't think that they needed to even go there, that this was just a strict textual analysis. When you look at the words of IEPA, you just cannot interpret it the way that the president wanted to. And then just to add and pick up on what Jan was saying, I think it was so striking, the language that he used when talking about the justices in this press conference. I mean, saying that they were swayed by foreign interest. He called them fools and lapdogs, unpatriotic and disloyal. These are justices, 2 of whom he nominated, who will also be deciding many more consequential opinions for the Trump administration. It was just very surprising to see him lash out at that level at the Supreme Court.
We're not
justices.
used to hearing that language from a president in regards to the Supreme Court.
Correct.
Katrina Kaufman, thank you.
Earlier, I spoke to former federal judge Michael McConnell. He was one of the lead lawyers who argued against these emergency power Trump tariffs. Michael, 2 questions to start. Your reading of the majority opinion and your reaction to President Trump saying those who ruled against him on the high court were disloyal to the Constitution.
I think anyone who reads the opinion will realize that it is based upon a very solid interpretation of the Constitution. Some may disagree with it, but the notion that it's disloyal to the Constitution is absurd.
And as you read the underlying law, the 1977 law, and what it allowed and what it did not allow, how far beyond that law do you think President Trump tried to take it?
Well, he took it completely beyond the law. This is the law having to do with sanctions on other countries in the event of conflicts, things like sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine and that sort of thing. It has nothing whatever to do with taxation on Americans. And tariffs are, in fact, taxations on American companies when they import foreign goods. IEPA, that's what we call that statute, has never been used for that before, and it's in 50 years history never been used for that.
The president also said from the podium of the White House today that the Supreme Court had become subject to foreign interference and that the litigants who brought this case were slime balls and sleaze balls not representing American interests. How do you respond to that?
I don't.
Why?
The comments of that they're not serious comments.
Because the court is something that isn't subject to any outside influence, or the litigants themselves have a viable place before the court?
Well, there's no doubt that these litigants had a viable place before the court. They are 5 small businesses who were taxed illegally, and they challenged that in court, as any American has the right to do.
When the president spent a lot of time extolling what he considered to be the constitutional virtues of the dissenting justices, specifically Brett Kavanaugh, how did you evaluate Justice Kavanaugh's interpretation that the law did allow for these tariffs and they're a common tool and presidents should have wide authority to be able to use them?
Well, I have enormous respect for Brett Kavanaugh. I think he's an excellent justice, but I think on this that he was wrong. One of the main points that he makes is that the major questions doctrine, which is the idea that Congress has to speak clearly when it makes large-scale delegations of power to the executive, doesn't apply in the field of foreign affairs. The problem with that argument is that the framers of our Constitution, back in 1787, knew that tariffs had an impact on foreign affairs. That was no mystery to them, and they nonetheless gave that power to Congress.
Right, and the first crisis, and it was a crisis for Andrew Jackson, his vice president, John Calhoun, resigned in the nullification crisis, which was a crisis over tariffs, and South Carolina saying that the federal government didn't have a right to impose the tariffs because it dealt with them economically through foreign powers. I mean, that's part of something this country wrestled with then, the Supreme Court wrestled with then. That is a part of this backdrop, is it not?
Well, sort of, but no, the Supreme Court didn't grapple with that. Congress grappled with that. Congress has been, throughout American history until very recently, Congress has been the forum for discussion of tariff policy. So, there was the Jackson episode, there were the McKinley tariffs, there were the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. All of these debates took place in Congress. Never before has a president taken over tariff policy the way President Trump has sought to do.
And I heard within the president's remarks today a kind of acknowledgement that other authorities exist, other authorities have always existed, and that he will use them now, but they're more cumbersome. But he always had those alternatives open to him.
Yes, he did. But he chose not to. I mean, he specifically used IEPA because it was unbounded, because there were no limits. There were no time limits, no procedural limits, no limits of any sort under his interpretation, of course.
Right. And Michael, how would you assess the importance of this question put before the court and the court's judgment on this matter of newly interpreted presidential power?
Of course, the immediate impact for the American public will be on prices. And it's very hard to know exactly, how fast or when. But the longer, and I suspect most important impact over the next, half century is going to be that this requires that the president stay in his lane, that the president has very important powers in our system, but he doesn't have unlimited powers. And if he's going to exercise a power that has been delegated to Congress, he has to be following congressional will and carrying out a congressional statute.
Last question, Michael. The president said this opinion said nothing about refunds of these tariffs, and he said we're going to be in court for 2 to 5 years. That suggests to me the administration has no intent, at least currently, to initiate the refunds. Is that how you read it? And what do you think that leaves the litigants who sought relief before the High Court on this particular matter?
I think my clients, the 5 small businesses in this case, will be entitled to their refunds immediately. That's what they sued for. They brought the claim. The government, at no point did the government argue that there was any reason not to give them the refunds to which they're entitled, other than their legal argument that the tariffs were properly imposed. It's the end of the case for them. Now, there are numerous other businesses out there that have paid taxes. Some of them have already filed for refunds. Many more will do so. Who knows how long those will take, but it doesn't seem like a very complicated procedure to me. Now, I'm not a trade lawyer, so I don't know for sure, but I don't see why these can't be processed relatively quickly.
They could be self-executing unless the administration doesn't want to execute them.
Well, the administration is within its rights to demand that they file suit. But once they're in court, they'll be in the Court of International Trade, the very court that we went to months ago and that held that the tariffs were illegal. I see no reason to doubt that the Court of International Trade will do its duty here.
Michael McConnell, I appreciate your time very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. President Trump said he will implement a 10% global tariff after the Supreme Court struck down most of the tariffs he imposed last year. The 6-3 decision, signed by both liberal and conservative justices, ruled the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, you're going to be hearing that a lot this show, does not give the president the authority to impose sweeping tariffs. The case stems from challenges to a series of executive orders the president signed, including on his so-called Liberation Day last April, where he invoked executive powers in that act. But the president says the ruling does not stop him from imposing tariffs in other ways. During a press conference earlier today, he read from the dissenting opinion. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was nominated by Trump during his first term, wrote that today's decision, quote, might not substantially constrain a president's ability to order tariffs going forward.
But other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected. We have alternatives. Great alternatives. Could be more money. We'll take in more money, and we'll be a lot stronger for it.
The president also attacked the 6 members of the high court that ruled in the majority, including 3 conservative justices, accusing them of being influenced by outside interests.
They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests and a political movement that is far smaller than people would ever think.
Legal correspondent Jan Crawford has the details of the decision.
I mean, I think we can call this one of the most significant Supreme Court losses for a U.S. president in modern history. The justices invalidating a cornerstone of President Trump's economic agenda, ruling that this federal emergency trade law did not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Of course, that now wipes out this baseline 10% tariff that's been levied on almost every one of our U.S. trading partners, as well as additional tariffs on other countries of up to 50%. President Trump, obviously furious. He lashed out at the court and the justices, turning his ire, speaking at the White House on the 3 conservatives who joined with the 3 liberals to invalidate the use of this law to impose tariffs. Specifically, he talked about Justice Neil Gorsuch, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 2 of his own appointees to the court, as well as the Chief Justice, John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion. Dissenting Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Trump's other nominee to the Supreme Court, argued that the law did authorize these tariffs, and he said, you know, it may not even be that significant because the president has other avenues, other trade laws that he can turn to impose tariffs that were, you know, basically accomplish the same thing. But those laws have significant constraints. They have time limits. One of them that he announced today has a 10%, has a 5-month cap, and they have a 10% cap on the amount. So he can't go upwards of 50%, threaten these high tariffs, and to use that as a negotiating tool. But at the White House today, President Trump said he was forging ahead and within days would be trying to impose that another baseline 10% tariff on pretty much all global imports across the world. So while today's decision is highly significant and a major defeat for the president, he is not giving up, and he is going to try to find other ways to impose these tariffs, despite some on the right and the left saying that perhaps the court had given him a gift in invalidating the tariffs. Back to you.
All right, Jan Crawford, thank you. CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett joins us now. What's your reaction?
Well, the president basically said this case matters to me a lot, and the court majority that disagreed with him because it mattered to him a lot was acting unpatriotically, under the influence of foreign outsiders, and disloyal to the Constitution. That summarizes the president's relationship to anything in our checks and balances system in our constitutional republic that disagrees with him. And he'll have to live with the political consequences of those kinds of remarks. The president tried on social media for months to pressure the Supreme Court to agree with him. What the Supreme Court did in the majority was look at the law, look at precedent, and see if what the president was arguing in public was valid constitutionally. It ruled 6-3, it wasn't. And that's now the law of the land.
What do you mean by he'll have to live with the consequences of those remarks?
It is a challenge to the Supreme Court itself, which we should remind ourselves is reviewing many other items before it, initiated by actions taken by this administration. So there's pending business before the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is a human institution. It has a memory. It knows what is being said about it, and being said specifically about it by a president. So there's that. And then the country can broadly in this midterm election campaign evaluate what it means when a president says, I've lost something to the Supreme Court, I cared about it, and the reason I lost is because they're disloyal to the Constitution, or they're influenced by foreigners, or they're Republicans in names only. Those are slanders, mostly, if not entirely, baseless. Yes, it's a rhetorical flourish, but does it in any way suggest to Americans deciding what they're going to do in the midterm elections just how this president thinks of his powers, the powers of the presidency, and our checks and balances system writ large?
So let's talk about the midterms. On our CBS News polling from December showed 63% of Americans oppose the president's tariffs. How do you think this latest stance will be perceived?
That is really a polling about inflation, because most Americans have heard that there is a potential and very real possible inflationary impact of all tariffs. They hear that. They see that the prices at the grocery store continue to bother them. So they're not really sure. They're not tax lawyers. They're not economists. They're not absolutely positively sure that tariffs are the reasons prices are still uncomfortably and stubbornly high, but they think they might be. And as a result, they would prefer less tariffs because they think that would translate for their pocketbooks in better and more beneficial ways. So the longer the president stays on tariffs, even though there is a constituency within his base that admires him for that because they believe it rebalances some of the ravages that they have felt, maybe personally or throughout their family or just across the economy writ large, from globalization, there is still a great percentage of Americans who don't like inflation, think tariffs have something to do with it, and if inflation continues, the president will pay some kind of noticeable political price.
Major Garrett, thank you. We'll see you Monday on The Takeout.
Thank you.
Let's go now to CBS News congressional reporter Torian Small. Torian, what's been the reaction from lawmakers?
Lindsay, an obvious partisan split here. Quite a few Republicans still backing the president. We heard from Congressman or Senator Bernie Moreno of Ohio saying that this is absolutely a slap in the face to the president's agenda that the Supreme Court ruled with us. He's in lockstep with the president on this one. But if we looked at leadership, I think we saw some really interesting responses. House Speaker Mike Johnson conceding defeat here, but saying that he and other members of his conference will work with the White House to go forth with his the president's agenda. But I do want to point out that Johnson and the president saw another significant loss when it comes to lawmakers last week when several Republicans joined Democrats in striking down a rule that would force lawmakers against the ability to draw resolutions against the president's tariffs. After that, we saw a resolution put forth by Representative Gregory Meeks that disapproved of Trump's tariffs against Canada. That was ultimately successful. Meeks saying in this decision from SCOTUS that this just reaffirms what they saw, that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act can't be used by the president unilaterally. And speaking of that act, I just want to point out one interesting statement from Representative or Senator Chuck Grassley, a Republican from Iowa. He said, in part in a statement, he's one of the only sitting members of Congress who was in office during that passage. Since then, he's made it clear that Congress needs to reassert its constitutional role over commerce. So again, across the aisle, we're seeing bipartisan praise for the Supreme Court decision and now a renewed push for Congress to step up and reaffirm that it is the sole branch when it comes to levying tariffs.
Okay, we'll see how that plays out. Torian Small, thank you. CBS News senior business and technology correspondent Jolene Ken joins us for a look at the economic implications. So, Joe, the Tax Foundation found tariffs cost each U.S. household $1,000 in 2025. That number was expected to go up to $1,400 this year. What could today's decision and the president's reaction mean, though, for the average person's wallet?
Well, we thought after the decision came down from the Supreme Court that there would be eventual gradual prices coming down. Then the president made his announcement that he's going to be adding this 10% global tariff through Section 122. And that sort of threw everything into disarray. And we've been crunching the numbers with the Yale Budget Lab. And they said originally each household, since the tariffs took place, the cost was about $1,700 in income. And now you're going to see potentially a savings, if you can call it that, of about $210. So the amount that you end up continuing to spend because of tariffs is relatively the same. There is a difference, but it's not super dramatic. And that has a lot of people worried about what's to come, especially small business owners. They were celebrating this morning for about an hour and a half, and then they started wondering, okay, what are we going to do now? And are we going to have to sue to get a refund with all of this stuff in motion? Uncertainty, I guess, is the word.
Yeah, what else are you hearing from businesses?
They were thrilled. They were elated. They were excited. They felt there was clarity after the Supreme Court decision. And then when President Trump took the podium and said he was going to pursue other means of levying tariffs, there was a sense of deflation and frustration that, small businesses power this economy. 2 small business owners tell me that they're planning to pursue getting their refunds back. Beth Beneke at Busy Baby in southern Minnesota, she says that she is planning to join a potential class action as the lead plaintiff to file to get her refunds. Last week, she just paid, $12,000, $15,000 to get her container of goods into the United States in order to be able to sell. And she says she's absorbed all of the costs, not able to keep all of her employees on board so she doesn't raise prices on her, moms and dads that she's selling products to. And she's just not sure how much more of that she can continue with, but she is going to go for that refund if she can. But the Treasury Secretary today saying it will be a long time before refunds are potentially issued, and consumers, in his view, may not even see that money in their pocket. So there's a long, winding road ahead, and there's going to be many, many lawsuits.
I do have a couple of those placemats at home. Jolene Kent, thank you so much.
Very good.
We return now to our top story. In a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court struck down most of President Trump's sweeping tariffs that he imposed last year. The president then announced a new tariff plan at a press conference today, saying, quote, other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones the court incorrectly rejected, end quote. CBS News' legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson joins me now. So what did the justices in the majority actually strike down, and what was the key reasoning?
It's good to talk to you again. So what the majority found is that the president does not have the power under this federal statute, the IEEPA, to impose these big reciprocal tariffs. Why not? Because if we start at the Constitution, which we always need to, the Constitution gives Congress the power to impose taxes, to regulate commerce. Can Congress give some of that power away? Absolutely. But they need to be very clear when they do give power away. And they need to say something akin to, and this gives the president the power to impose tariffs. In this case, what the majority said is that's not in this particular statute. And therefore, the president stepped beyond his authority when he tried to use this federal law to impose the tariffs. Lindsay, as you said, that doesn't mean this is the end of the road when it comes to the president trying to impose tariffs. He's looking at other legal avenues. He's looking at other statutes to see if that will give him the power to do so.
So could the other authority he's trying to invoke also be met with legal challenge?
Absolutely. And I think at this point, the president has pointed to a couple of different statutes, one of them, a particular statute, and he's pointing to a particular part, section 122. I don't think it's ever been used to impose a tariff before. It would require a finding of a trade deficit, and then it allows the president, I believe, to impose tariffs for 150 days. At that point, Congress would need to ratify. So I think what we're seeing, Lindsay, with all the other options is that more is required on the front end. There are more requirements, and more is limited on the back end, meaning these statutes don't quite allow the president to do what he wanted to do with these particular tariffs, which is basically that they would go on for an indefinite period of time and apply broadly to lots of different goods and services and lots of different countries as well.
You taught a bunch of classes today. What were some of the top lines that you and your students talked about?
So what we talked about is, I said, let's remember the federal government is a government of enumerated powers. What does that mean? It means that Congress can only act if the Constitution says, here's how you can act. The president can only act if the Constitution says, here's how you can. And that this decision is really a decision in my mind that affirms the idea that we have a separation of powers, that Congress gets to do this stuff generally, but it can give some of this power away, but it has to give the president a roadmap. We also, to be honest, talked about the idea that a lot of my students feel like this is a conservative court, but this is a big loss for the Trump administration. And we talked about how this case might be different from other cases where the president has said, I have really broad power, and the Supreme Court says yes. That's typically when the president is making decisions about his branch, the executive branch. Here, the president is leaping outside the executive branch, and we have a different outcome.
My tuition check is in the mail. Jessica Levinson, thank you. How could the Supreme Court's ruling on the emergency tariffs impact your wallet? The overall average effective tariff rate, or how much on average it costs to import items, went down about 8 percentage points because of the emergency tariffs being invalidated, according to Yale's Budget Lab. That's still the highest rate since 1946, though, excluding 2025. When you put that into dollars, if the Supreme Court had upheld the tariffs, the average consumer would have paid between $1,300 and $1,700 more over the course of 2026 without being able to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, that we keep talking about. That number fell. It's still between $600 and $800 more in 2026. That's because the Supreme Court's ruling will only target tariffs that were put into effect by IEPA. So out of all the tariff revenue collected last year, about half of it could be refunded and is no longer eligible to be levied this year. Other tariffs implemented by the Trump administration are still in effect. Take a look at your screen. The ones imposed under a national security exemption of trade law known as Section 232. We've been talking about that, too. That includes tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, timber, buses, some semiconductors. Some of those tariffs, like steel and aluminum, are as high as 50%. The group likely to see the largest effect from these tariffs being overturned are American businesses. They pay the brunt of tariff costs when importing products and haven't really passed the majority on to consumers, according to CBS News Money Watch. Even before today's Supreme Court decision, more than 1,500 companies had filed lawsuits in trade court, according to Bloomberg. That includes major companies like Costco, Crocs, and Goodyear Tires. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Reuters last week the Treasury has enough to reimburse IEPA tariff revenue if ordered to, but today's Supreme Court decision didn't set forward a specific plan for that.
Welcome back. President Trump said today he is going to chart a new course on tariffs using some existing laws to do some tariffs. But it's unclear if Republicans in Congress will offer their support or continue to stay, if they can, out of the sort of firing range of conversation about tariffs. Here's my conversation with the editor of the Dispatch, Steve Hayes, on this topic and many others. The Supreme Court told President Trump, no, you don't have the expansive powers you thought you did on tariffs. The president will clearly be unhappy, but there are other remedies. How do you think this lands from a political perspective, Steve, and from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I mean, on the policy side, I don't think the president should be particularly surprised by this. This is something that people were saying was likely to happen, I think, even as he announced these tariffs under these emergency tariffs under IEPA, as it's called. So on a policy perspective, I think the White House has been gaming out for quite some time alternative paths to doing the same thing. I think the question will be, how do Republicans in Congress handle this? There's already some suggestion that they're going to try to codify these tariffs through legislation. If they do, it would be one of the first times Congress has done its job, if I have to say, on these matters. But there's a complication there because so many Republicans, including Republicans who are publicly supportive of the president on tariffs, are privately skeptical, and some even opposed to the president. So I think this makes that a knotty process for him.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Steve, because it goes to something that I believe is somewhat consistent with some relationships that this president has with Republicans in Congress. They like him to use executive authority because then they don't have to vote on it. But if there's a reconciliation bill, which is something that gets through the House on a majority vote and just through a simple majority in the Senate, then they would have to vote on it. And then this question would be right in their political breadbasket.
That's exactly right. And, look, even somebody like Senate Majority Leader John Thune has been a longtime opponent of tariffs and protectionist policy more broadly. Now, he's been somewhat friendly to President Trump. He hasn't thrown up many roadblocks in front of President Trump's approach to trade, generally speaking, even though I think he has personal misgivings about the effects, particularly on farmers and the ag industry in South Dakota. How does John Thune handle something like this? Does he work with the president to try to come up with these alternatives, or does he say, hey, look, I'm a Reaganite on the question of trade and tariffs, and I'm not in favor of this. And by the way, neither is the majority of my Senate Republican conference.
I'm always mindful, and President Trump has taught me to be mindful about the importance of his populist appeal. I imagine those close to him will talk about this as a decision that sides with globalists and globalist economic trend lines that have devoured the aspirations of the middle class and the lower middle class in our country, and I've got to fight even harder.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that's exactly what you're going to hear increasingly and in increasing volume in the coming days. Look, and that has a certain appeal. I mean, there's no question that the Republican Party, the base of the Republican Party, is strongly where Donald Trump is on this. And as I said, you even have some Republicans in Congress who don't agree with the president, who are willing to amplify those arguments because they know that it appeals to his base. So I think you can expect that the president will do this. There may be another side boon to this. You know, lots of economists have suggested that if the president isn't allowed to continue to impose these tariffs, there will be economic benefits. You know, there are some studies that have shown as many as 96% of the costs of these tariffs has gone on to American consumers, not the foreign companies and foreign countries that the president has suggested. In these refunds to those companies, are there economic benefits? Certainly some of the economists I've talked to think that there are.
All right, let's broaden this out a bit, Steve, because if you were to write a one-sentence summary of the biggest issues in the first year of Trump 2.0, you would have said tariffs and immigration. I think anyone would have come up with those two as the two biggest, most jarring, most aggressive applications of understood or implied executive powers. Where do you think President Trump and his administration stand on immigration right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some self-inflicted wounds here from the president on immigration. You're right. I mean, if you look back at just look at the exit polling after the 2024 presidential election, people were strongly in favor, including many independents, of what the president was proposing on immigration. I think people have liked what the president has done as it relates to closing the border, ending the sort of flood of illegal immigrants that we saw coming in through the Biden administration. But they don't like what I think many people regard as the over-the-top policies, deporting people, going after people who aren't the hardest of the hard criminals. And that, I think, has had some negative effects. We've seen the president's polling slide over basically beginning at the end of last year through the first 6 weeks of this year. On the question of immigration, I think it's now a toss-up, whether it's a benefit to the president or a political negative.
So the numbers economically, the White House points to suggest robust growth, super high foreign investment, domestic investment, manufacturing, but there is not a lot of job growth. And I wonder if you think that is a tailwind, or rather a headwind, forgive me, for this economy, for this administration, and for Republicans broadly in the midterms.
Yeah, I think it certainly could be. I mean, this is a mixed economic picture. I mean, people who've been doing this for a lot longer and who know a lot more about this than I do don't know how to read these various contradictory indicators. But I think if you look sort of broadly at the question of job growth in particular, you have seen a slowing over the first year, and particularly compared to the last 4 years. There's no question that could have real effects as people are increasingly concerned, and there's increased chatter, both among economists, but also among people just having real conversations over their kitchen tables about the implications of artificial intelligence on the job picture and on the economy more broadly. So I do think it has a potential to create some additional challenges for the president to make as he makes his best case to the American public, and Republicans do, that they should retain both houses of Congress and the president's support.
Steve Hayes, a pleasure. I hope we'll do it again.
Thanks, Major.
The Port of Los Angeles, the nation's busiest port, which processes about a third of U.S. imports and exports, saw a 13% decline in January of this year compared to the same period last year. It also saw an 8% drop in cargo it handled year over year. Executive Director Gene Soroka blamed an early cargo surge in 2025 as businesses rushed to get ahead of tariffs. And Gene joins us now in Studio 57. Thank you so much for being here. So there's clearly still a lot that we don't know. What are you hearing from businesses?
Well, a lot of questions, and probably more so than we have answers right now. But Supreme Court rescinded the specific tariffs that account for about 2/3 of all that have been assessed over the last year. That being said, questions come about of when do I get a refund? How do I apply for one? Is there going to be a refund plan in place? Second, what's going to happen next? The administration had been telegraphing new tariffs if these international emergency economic powers were declined by the Supreme Court. And we heard the president announce just that this afternoon. Section 122 tariffs of the Economic Expansion Act were initiated through executive order today. The question remains, when, how much, and does it affect me as an importer? Because they're a little more prescriptive. And then lastly, what is all this going to do to the cargo flow? Are we going to see a quick surge after Lunar New Year, or is it going to be the traditional lull that we witnessed here at the end of the first quarter?
So with this uncertainty, how do businesses still prepare? Because you mentioned the more prescriptive tariffs, the 10% global tariffs, that's a finite amount of time, right? 150 days. We don't exactly know when they're going to be imposed. And so businesses are still having to make these decisions. You mentioned back to school, all the summer, spring fashion. How do they start to make those calculations when the calendar doesn't change?
It's really tough. The executives I've spoken to just this week in New York alone are still planning different scenarios as opposed to focusing on the execution of their supply chain systems. The other piece to this is that purchase orders for retailers typically go out to Asia about 3 months in advance of shipments. I'm not seeing many cancellations right now, so that bodes well for the economy, us as a leading indicator, and the cargo flow continuing to come. But a lot of decisions will be based on price and timing and whether these new tariffs impact specific commodity groupings.
How do you staff your port not knowing what's coming in?
We're pretty resilient and flexible. The cargo volume that's moving through right now, Lindsay, is right at about where our 5-year average is. Last year, pretty high comps with people advancing inventories ahead of tariffs. A little bit of an outlier from my view, but realistically speaking, we've got the longshoremen, the skilled workers on the ground, the machinery, and the land to be able to handle even a little bit of an uptick coming after the holiday.
Gene Soroka, we always appreciate when you visit us. Thank you so much.